looks like we got Jeremy on, we got Richard on. Good to see you all this morning. So today's session is all about custom JavaScript, and there's a pretty good chance that we'll not be able to get through all of it today because it's a pretty meaty section. But we will go in and go through a bunch, and then we'll see how we feel at the end. And if there's more to cover and there's more questions to answer and all that, then we'll definitely go through and break this into a second session so that we don't take everybody's entire Saturday up. But I feel like there's going to be a lot to cover here. So we'll go ahead and get started. But the big things with custom JavaScript, we kind of went through in the last session in custom CSS, and we covered how to select elements using CSS. And what we use for custom JavaScript, or what I use in ClickFunnels specifically, is jQuery. And jQuery is great because it specifically uses very, very similar selectors, in fact, identical selectors in the majority of cases, to be able to say, here's an element, find this element on the page, and then take some sort of action on it. And that's actually why it's called jQuery, because you're querying the what's called the document object model, the DOM, and you're querying that for elements on the page. And then you're saying, okay, take some action on this element. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here, and we'll just kind of start walking through this. And I'm gonna share, I'm actually gonna share this desktop here. And then let's minimize some of this stuff here. And I'm gonna drag over, this is just an example. I just happen to have this pulled up. This is some custom code I've worked on in the past. This is actually my CF Ajax submit add-on, and I think this one is inside of the CF Pro Tools VIP club. Sorry, my dog is in. My dog. Hey, I didn't let everybody know. We have made the full-time move to Boise, Idaho. Actually, Eagle, Idaho, but just outside Boise. I've been transitioning and traveling back and forth from Indiana to Idaho for the last little over a year. My wife comes out here, I go back there, back and forth. Well, we're both officially here full time, and so my dog is here as well. So my dog is sitting on the floor just outside the view of the camera. And so if you see me nudge him every once in a while, it's because he's licking on his feet or doing something funny. So, but yeah, so we're excited about that. But anyway, so I've got this, we've got this piece of custom code here. And this custom code, you might recognize some of this stuff from what we had talked about last session with custom CSS. We've got this ability to check on attributes and then find elements based on this. So this selector right here says, hey, give me any element where the href attribute, which is what you would have on a link, an anchor tag would have an href. Where should this link go? So find me any element that has an href that equals hashtag Ajax -submit. And so that's what this, the square brackets, the selector is exactly the same. You could do the same thing with custom CSS and apply some sort of style to it if you wanted to. The only difference would be you'd have, in this one, you'd have, if you wanted to do styles, you'd have style tags, like we talked about last time, and then you would take this exact same thing, and then we could say, okay, so if we wanted to have, say, for any link that has that href, we could say, oh man, I'm having trouble typing today, declaration. We want to make sure it's underlined. So this would just say, hey, find me any element that has an href of Ajax submit, and make sure the text declaration on that is set to underline. So we went through this and kind of in the custom CSS, and jQuery really uses the same rules to find elements on the page. And then in this case, we've got a comma, which means, okay, find this element, or find an element that has a data-image link that's equal to Ajax-submit. So what this does is inside of ClickFunnels, this is how they use images to actually make them linkable. And so they would both have the same URL. So we're just saying, grab me any link that has this, or grab me any image that has an attribute of data-image link. And then the next thing we do is actually call what's called a function on that. And in that function, we're gonna do something, right? So jQuery, one of the things we can do is, hey, for these elements on, and then click. So which means, hey, when somebody clicks on one of these elements, then we pass in what we call an anonymous function. we're going to call, so we have a function here. And you'll notice up here we have a function, but there's nothing after that function to give it any sort of name. So in JavaScript, a lot of times you would have a named function like my awesome function. And then we would have parentheses where we can pass in what are called parameters. And so we can have param1, param2. This is the ability to pass in data to that function call that we can then use with inside of that function. So this is a named function because we call function, which just tells the JavaScript that, hey, I'm creating a function here. I'm defining a function. And this is the name that I want to give to my function so that I can call it somewhere else. And then these are the parameters that I want to define that people can pass in that I can then reference. And we could say something like if param1 equals param2, then we'll just say spit something out to the console. Yay, there, oh, there. That's not what I want. Same. Okay, and so this would basically be just a defined function that says, hey, somebody can pass in param1, somebody can pass in param2. These are just values that are going to be passed in when they call a function. And then this one says, hey, if the param1 is the same as param2, then output to the developer console a message that just says, yay, they're the same. So this is a named function. So now up in here, we can actually call that function. And we could just, then all we have to do is say my awesome function. And we can pass Jamie band. And so we're passing those values in. And so, and we can see from this one that they're not the same. So this isn't going to be output. There's nothing going to be written to the console. But if we made them the same, then it would output this statement. Kind of a silly example, not sure what anyone would ever use that for, but this is just kind of the difference between what we have here, which is anonymous function. We have no name between function and the actual list of parameters. But in this case, we have a name. So we have anonymous functions and we have named functions. Named functions are generally things that are going to be used over and over again. So you might have the same logic that you might need to apply. And let me see if I've got, let's see if we've got any useful code here pulled up with named functions. Probably not, but actually this one probably does. Okay, so we can, let's see. Yes, so we can see in this case, this is the promo code pro add-on. And you'll see in this one, I have a named function called CFCheck promo code. And I actually use that in several places. So you can see here, I want to be able to do the same thing. It's the same logic. I'm just checking to see if this promo code is valid. So I'm going through and I'm saying, hey, find out what was entered, find out what the input name is, go through and do all this stuff and see if it's actually valid and check to see if and update the products and do all that work. I don't have to write that multiple times. I just want to be able to have the code written one time, but be able to use it in multiple places. So in this case, I've got, I want to do when somebody presses the enter key on my input, my promo code input field, so on key press means they pressed a key in that field. If the key that they pressed is number 13, which is our enter key, then I want to, and I'm going to check the value. If it has a value, meaning that they actually entered, there is something in the input field, then call that promo code, check to see if the promo code is valid. But I also want to be able to do, if they just click off the field, if they type something in, they don't click enter, but they just, they click off on some other field or they click off the page, I also want to go ahead and check at that point. So we do that on what's called the blur event. So when somebody leaves an input field, then the blur event is called because they've left. So we have a focus event when somebody enters a field, and then we have a blur event when they leave the field. And so I want to call that same code So we have these two separate instances of that code being called, but they both call the exact same function. And so the exact same stuff happens either way. So it just saves us effort of having to take all this code that I wrote down here inside of this function, instead of having to duplicate that. And there's a lot of it. You can see there's a lot of code here. We wouldn't want to have to rewrite this. We wouldn't have to have all that included multiple times. It'd be huge. So instead of having to put all that right here in this place, we can just have this named function that we call, and it actually fires all that code. So it's our developer way of being lazy. So I say that the smartest things come out of lazy people. And so it's just, you know, when you don't want to have to do things multiple times, you find ways to do it once and then be able to use that effort multiple times. So we always look at, as developers, we try and follow the rule of, we call it the DRY principle, which stands for don't repeat yourself. So if you do something once, then you can just put it in line. I could have just put if I was only going to ever call this code in one place, then I could just take all that code and put it right in here. Instead of having this function call, I would just put the code right there. But in this case, I have it at least twice that I want to call that same code and do that same function. So I don't want to repeat myself. I'm going to extract this out, put it into its own named function, and then I'm just going to call that function in two different places. And I'm pulling up the chat here. So yeah, if you have questions, yeah, Nan says in other languages, they may call it a subroutine. Yeah, absolutely. Different things, we can call them functions, we can call them methods, we can call them routines, we can call them subroutines, we can call all these different things. They go by different names depending on your language. Within JavaScript, we call them functions. Within a lot of object-oriented programming languages like Rails, C#, we'll call them methods. So methods on an object has methods, and JavaScript has functions. So yeah, so and I'll tell you this, one thing that I'll share is that I write coding in a lot of different languages. I've worked in a lot of different languages for a lot of years. And so I don't necessarily try and remember the exact syntax for everything or the exact name of what things are called. But what I do try and remember is that Google is my friend, and I can look up just about anything that I need to figure out on a specific a specific language or a specific syntax for a particular language, as long as I know what's available or what's possible. And so that's where it's kind of great. Once you learn some of these principles, you can look and say, okay, well, I know I can do this thing, and I can do it in this language, and it's probably available or similar in another language. So let me just do a quick Google and find that. So we call those programming constructs. I'm actually going to pull up a document here. Let me see if I can get this going here. So we'll call these programming constructs. And so kind of what I've been going through with the functions is one of the constructs. And so this is something I learned early on as a developer, is that the most important thing that you can understand with any sort of programming language is what are the constructs? What are the things that you can do? And these really are pretty universal when it comes to computer programming. Some languages have, additions, but as a general rule, if you know the basic constructs of, computer technology, then you can really apply those same constructs to pretty much any language. And so we look at those things, and those things are things like functions and methods. So we'll say functions / methods. Most programming languages have some, they might call it a different thing, but they've got some, some similar tool of a function or a method. The other things that you'll have are loops. And loops are things like, you can do for each loops, which will iterate over a package, an array, an object, a set of keys or something like that, and say for each element in this thing, then loop and take some action on that thing. And so every language has some ability to do some sort of for each loops. Then we also have while loops. And while loops evaluate while something is true. Wow, I'm really not doing good with the spelling today. So a while loop is something you can say, hey, while this thing is true, then loop. And then what you do is within that, then you would say you would do some sort of evaluation. And then if you finally reached your destination, then you set a variable to false that the while is checking. And so once you set that to false, then the loop stops. So you escape out of that loop. So that's a while loop, and we'll run through some basics of of these different types, so we can kind of understand these constructs. And then you also have for loops, and for loops are things that are do counters. And so for loops would be for I equals 0, do something I not 1, y equals 0, and then you might say I is greater or is less than 10, and I plus plus. And so that's basically saying, hey, loop, we're going to start with I being equal to 0, and then as long as I is less than 10, then do this. And then once you've done that, then increase I by 1. So I plus plus means add 1 to I. And then do the loop again, and then do this again. And then so you'll loop through this until I is greater than 10. Until I is reaches 10 or greater, which it will never will be greater because it's going to escape out of the loop. And so this is another way to do a loop. So these are the main types of loops that you'll use most often. So you've got for each loops, you've got while loops, and you've got for loops. Fors are used for counters. I want to count a certain number of things. I want to do this a certain number of times. Then you can use that for loop. For each loops are like, hey, I have a set of things. I want to just go through each of those things. I don't care how many there are. I've received an array of a certain number of values. So I want to loop through that entire array, regardless of how many there are, and I want to take the same action on each one of those things. And then the while loop is, again, I don't necessarily know in advance how many things there are. I just know I want to loop in this thing until I get it could be an instance of I want to loop through until I find the element that I'm looking for. And then you could then, it could be the first element, could be the 10th element, could be the 100th element. We don't know. We're going to loop through until we find that thing. Until that thing is false, then we're going to keep looping through until we find it. So those are some examples of those. So loops are one of the most important constructs. The other ones are your logic constructs. And we'll just, those are things like, most often you're going to use if, then, else sorts of logic. So, something like that is going to be if this equals true, do this. Else, do that. So that's kind of an if, then, else. And so, or this is actually just an if, else. But if, then do this. If this equals true, then do this. Else, do this other thing. So that's an if, then, else statement. You also have the ability to do an else if. Like this. So then you've got, if this is true, do this. Else, if that is true, then do that. Else, do the other. So this is just, so this is a fallback. So this is going to happen if either of these other two cases aren't true. And so you can run through, and you can have as many of these nested as you want to. And we'll go through and do some examples of this. But you could say, if this, then do that. Else, if, do this other thing. Else, if this other thing is true, then do this other thing. Else if, you can have as many of these nested as you want to. And then your else is that finally, if none of those other things were true, then do this thing. And so these are ways, so only one of these is ever going to evaluate and actually function. It's if this if this is true, then we'll never reach the do the other. We'll only reach the do this. And the same as that is true, then we'll only reach the do that. We'll never do this, and we'll never do that. So that's kind of the if then else structure, and we'll kind of run through some examples of that. So that's one logic construct is the if then else. And another one, and actually let me drop this so it makes a little more sense. We'll do this. Okay, so that's some examples. And then another way to do a pretty similar thing, but in a much better structure, if you're going to have a lot of options, is called a switch. And a switch is something where you say switch, and this syntax isn't going to be right. And again, all your different programming languages will have some version of this switch. And what you'll do is you'll actually, depending on what you're trying to program in, is you'll actually go in and you'll change your syntax based on the language. So some of them represent it in a slightly different way, but they have the concept of a switch and a concept of an if then else. All of your major languages have those concepts. Same with the loops. The structure of how you create a for loop might be slightly different in Java than it is in C#, but the concept of the for loop exists in all the different languages. And so a switch is basically taking in a value, and so we're going to say, okay, switch, based on my variable, and then let me do this. Get this on. We'll do this in code where it looks a little bit better, and then you're going to define values. So if my variable is equal to Jamie, then do this. Else, if my variable is equal to Dan, then do that. So this makes it, oh. And then default, do the other. So this is pretty similar, you can see, to the if then else. So, but it's a much easier way to actually, we're working on the value that's being passed in. Where in this case, we're having some sort of a statement that's being evaluated. So the switch is great if you have I just want to look at a specific variable to see whether it's set to 1, 2, 3, 5, or 10, or whether it's set to Jamie, Dan, Richard, or Jeremy. And based on what the value is, I'm going to take different actions. So a lot of those things would be if you're accepting, say an order, and you're looking at, okay, which product did they buy? Then look at the product ID. And if it was product ID 1, then do this. Product ID 2, do this other thing. Product ID 3, do this other thing. So that could be logic that where you're saying, okay, I want to see what they purchased on the order form. And if they purchase product 1 on the order form, send them to this OTO page. If they purchase product 2, send them to this other OTO page. And if they purchase product 3, send them to the other order OTO page. So you could build some custom logic that way using a switch. You could do the same thing almost all the time. Every time you can rewrite a switch as an if then else, but it gets a little unwieldy because the if then else structure, the syntax of it is much longer. So a switch is a simpler way to write something that's simple validation, but they do pretty much the same thing. So a switch is another construct that you'll use. Just know, as long as you know loops and if then else, you've really hit the majority of the constructs. And then the other things you'll have, so we talked about functions and methods. The other thing you'll have are variables. And variables are just like in algebra that we always said in high school, when would I ever use this stuff? Well, I actually use it quite a bit when it comes to writing programming. And when you're doing any sort of validation on numbers and things like that, then you end up using some algebraic equations for that. But variables are when you say, x plus y equals 6, figure out what the x and y is. If x is 2, then what's y? If y is 4, then what's x? So in those cases, x and y are the variables. Their values might change depending on the value of something else. So that's where we'll go in and we'll see here that we're setting these vars, VAR, for variable, and we give it a name, and then in that value we're going to assign it a value. So in this case, we're giving it the value of an actual jQuery object that is a span element that has this class applied to it, these classes applied to it, and has the text of apply. So we've created an element here, and then we've assigned that element to the variable apply button. And then what we can see is now we've gone down here later, because we've got a definition of this thing in our variable, it's stored this value. Then we can then now reference that variable later in our code, instead of having to put all of this stuff inside of here. I can just reference the variable name. And I can also say something like, if I wanted to go in and say if, var name, let's say if, we'll just say customer name, or actually we'll just do product ID. If product ID equals 1, then we're going to say, apply button equals this other thing. And so, and then we could do, set it down here, do that. And then now we've got a different value for this based on some logic here. But in here, we don't have to have that logic. We just know that, hey, whatever apply button is, go ahead and append it to this element because we've set a different value up above. And so this is kind of the beauty of variables, is you can change those things, and whatever the value is at the time, that's what gets inserted here. And so that's kind of our use for variables, is they're containers of data that might change over time. And then also we can pass those things into our functions. And so, in this case, we're passing in all main prods. And so we're setting these things up above, and then we've got a function here. This is part of the underscore library. So that's why it starts with underscore. There's actually a library like jQuery called underscore. It's also included with ClickFunnels. So because we have underscore here, we can say, okay, call into underscore, and then give me a unique. So take this array, and I'm going to pass in the array and give me the unique values. Return me a unique array of those values. And so that's what we've got going here. And so we're passing in that variable, and that variable may change, and then we can pass it in here, and then our functions accept those variables, and we can pass in those variables to other calls. And same thing here. We've got a function being called, and this one's an anonymous function, and we're passing in parameters, and they have variable names. And then we're going to reference those same variable names later in the code to be able to use those things. And so, so those are our variables. And so these are kind of the core things that we need to kind of keep in mind and know that, okay, here's the things I can do. I can kind of create reusable containers of code, and we'll call those things functions or methods. Then I have containers of data. Well, those things are called variables. Then I have the ability to loop through things, and I can loop through a package of things over each one of them and do certain things, or I can loop while something is evaluating to true, or I can loop through a specific number of times. I can just do a for loop. And then I also, from within those things, I can do if then else logic to say, okay, if this is true, do that. If this is true, if this other thing is true, then do the other thing. And I can do that in a couple of different ways. So once we have all of those things, we can combine them together into writing our programs, or our, in this case, our custom code, our custom JavaScript snippets to make the magic happen. And doing that specifically within ClickFunnels, I always use jQuery to do that, because jQuery gives you a lot of helpers along the way to make things simpler to do. It was written specifically for interacting with HTML pages. And so there's a lot of helper functions built in that just don't come out of the box with regular JavaScript. So they've done a lot of the heavy lifting for you. And because ClickFunnels has already included it, it's no additional strain on the pages. The pages already have it. So all you have to do is, is actually use the library that's already included. versus, you know, and it simplifies the code a lot of times, because a lot of the same things that you'd want to do if you were writing it as pure vanilla JavaScript that your browser understood without any external library, it's going to be a lot longer to write that same code. And so jQuery is great for that. There's also the underscore library is also included in your ClickFunnels pages. It's more of a utility sort of library. It has some very specific things that are cool, like making an array unique. That's something that's not built in as a jQuery library. So having it available is a great thing. So being able to call that from with underscore is really the majority of the time. That's what I use that for. Is like you just strip out all the extra duplicate values here. And so, yeah, so that's why I always use jQuery. So you'll always see that when we're using this $ in here, that generally represents jQuery. So that's just a shortcut function for calling jQuery. So we could also write jQuery right here, and it would do the exact same thing. So the $ is just a shortcut method for calling jQuery. And so we can also say, you know, jQuery here and say, okay, jQuery, go find me any element that has the data DE type attribute of ORPO. And then when you find that element, or all of those elements, because this will loop through and call this function on each one of those elements, then hide them on the page. So make them hidden. So that's a quick example. And so, so we want to use jQuery basically to do and to put together these constructs. And so, yeah, so those are kind of some basic foundational stuff. And then next, let's run in and actually do some examples and work through some of the things that are the common things to do within ClickFunnels. And while we get ready to do that, I'm going to go let my dog out before he drives. And Dan asked, besides jQuery and underscore, what other libraries are built into CF? Those are the two majors. I'm trying to think if there's another library. There's a few other packages that are built in. I don't have an exhaustive list by any stretch. There's a few that I wish were built in that are not, and you might see those get included several times. So like the customer info replacer. So let's see, customer info v2, I believe. Nope, actually that's not the one. Let's do, trying to think, there's one that I include quite a bit called handlebars. So we'll just do location swapper. So location swap, you'll notice here that we include a library called handlebars. It's actually a jQuery plugin. This one I wish was included with ClickFunnels out of the box, but it's not. So I actually have to include it at the top of the add-ons to make sure that it exists before I can use the code. That gives me the ability to set, you know, set data values for, you know, city, country name, state, and then this actually will loop through. So now when I call this swap, I can call this HTML and call this template and pass in my data, and then handlebars. This is a handlebars function. So I'm compiling, using handlebars, I'm compiling my source, which is my data, my HTML, I'm compiling that, which then goes through and says, okay, get, you know, give me this structure, kind of go through and be able to loop through it and define what my values are. And then I can replace that in my HTML later. Using my template function that also comes with handlebars. And so, or actually template is my function name here. So this is actually returning a function. So I'm calling that function and passing in my data. And so this gives me the ability to say, then put on my page, I can actually, handlebars is one where you actually put in like double curly brackets, city, in your text, and handlebars will look for any place that has these double curly brackets, and that's what they call handlebars. And whatever's in between those is a data name. So I have a city in here, so it will replace that city with whatever my value is. So that's going to pull my location.city value from my GeoIP, and it's going to give it that value. So then city, these double, all of this will get replaced with the city name. So that's the location swap add-on, and it uses the handlebars library. That is not included with ClickFunnels. I wish it was, but it's not. It's based on jQuery as well. So you have to have jQuery included, which luckily it already is, so we don't have to include that. Underscore is another good one that's already there. And it seems like there's a few other libraries that are already included, but they're not. So like jQuery is an entire library. It's a kind of a framework of code and functions. Then you've got a lot of plugins to the jQuery library. There's a few of those plugins that are included. Things like the countdown library. Countdown is how all of our countdowns work. So the jQuery countdown library is included. And so you can write your own countdowns if you want to, or you can modify the existing ClickFunnels countdowns based on that library. And so let me see if I have FOMO countdown. So let's see here. So this is actually another good one that's included, and that is the moment, the jQuery moment library. And so that's included. So moment is a great one for doing timestamps and math, dates, things like that. So you can see in this one, it's the moment is giving us the current timestamp. In this one, we're going to convert it to UTC, and then we're going to format it by giving us just X, I think is actually there is a Unix timestamp. So that's why we're setting this variable TS equal to the current timestamp in UTC time. So it's universal translated time zone instead of our local time zone, which is what generally happens is the moment looks at the local browser to see what time zone the local browser is in. So yeah, so moment is another good one that you'll probably use quite often because it gives you the ability to look at the current date, add dates, subtract dates, and so we can do one with date replace with math. There we go. So this is another one. So we've got this is an add-on one. I use handlebars in this one, and then we also are using moment. In this case, we've got $MOM equal to moment. So, and you'll notice that sometimes in my code, I use this $MOM. This just represents to me that this $ tells me that this is a jQuery object that's being stored in this variable. So I know I can do jQuery functions directly on this object. When it's called put inside of in front of a parentheses here like this, then this is actually the name of the jQuery function. This is a shortcut to that jQuery function. And so, and like this, in this case, when we do a $dot, that's saying jQuery as an object, call the each function on that. So when it's put in front of a variable name like this, it's not representative of jQuery. This is just a little shortcut way of me knowing that this is a jQuery object being stored in this variable so that I can identify it more easily. But you can see we've got a moment here, which gives us a timestamp. And to that, I want to add a certain number of units. So my quantity might be a number and my units might be seconds, hours, minutes. And then if I have add in the title, then add a certain number of quantity and a certain number of units. And if it's not, then it must be a subtract. So they're going to subtract from that moment the number of units from that. So moment is another good one. Handlebars is a good one that's not included that should be. And then countdown, the jQuery countdown element. And let's see if we actually, I don't think we're doing anything on countdowns in this one. Let me think of one. Every mince. So in this one, we're actually modifying, and this one we actually have, we're using moment as well because it's included. We're using handlebars as well. And then in this case, we are going to modify the countdown using the countdown library. And so when we're saying, hey, this means grab me my, this is representative of the current element being returned by this. So this is a countdown object. And so I'm going to call on that element, I'm call a countdown function. And this is a library called countdown. And it takes in some parameters, and then you can take, make changes to that existing countdown element. So countdown is another good one just to be aware of that it's there, because when you know it's there, then you can use it and you can actually look it up. So if we go in and do a quick Google on jQuery countdown, then the one we're looking at is actually this Keith Wood jQuery Countdown. So this is the actual jQuery Countdown library that's included with ClickFunnels. And so this is just the documentation page for that. And it's very dated, as you can see, as far as the design goes, but the functionality is great. And you have actually a quick ref here for all the things that you can do with this countdown library. So you've got all the different attributes, the labels, the things you can modify, and like the different things that we'll do. So you can say, okay, I want to give it an expiry URL. So when that expires, I don't know why this is, let's refresh this page. I don't know why that's popping up. So if I go to the quick ref, then we can see, so, you know, we've got things like the expiry URL always expires. On expiry means pass in a function, and it tells you a callback for when the countdown expires, what to do. On tick, so for every, when the countdown is updated, which means every second, then call this function. And tick interval is how often to update this. So a tick is by default is 1. So every second it's going to tick, and you could set that to 1,000 if you wanted to, and every 1,000 seconds it's going to tick, or every 60 seconds. So it could just do a minute countdown. So every minute, and then you could use in combination that on tick to actually set something to happen every minute in your page. And so there's, you know, there's some good uses in learning what these options are and what you can do with it. And then you've got things that like you can figure out based on when somebody, you know, you can call a pause, you can call a resume, you can call a destroy on your countdown elements. So you could have a hidden countdown timer on your page that gives somebody 5 minutes from the time they land on the page to actually take an action. And if they don't take that action, then it could redirect them to another page. But if they take that action, you could then destroy the countdown and it will stop. And then your redirect will never happen. So there's some cool things that, as long as you know that these options are available and these things, there's things you can do, then you can use those codes to build up your own functionality. So those are the key ones that I look at that I reference quite a bit inside of ClickFunnels are countdown, moment, and handlebars. Handlebars I have to include externally because it is not automatically included inside of ClickFunnels. And then underscore I don't use a lot. There's a few very specific functions inside of underscore. You can actually look up JavaScript underscore library, I think should pull us up the documentation. So yeah, so you can find underscore.js, and it will walk you through all the different you know, all the different things that are available inside. You know, what can you do on arrays? What are the functions that are available? What are the objects that are available? And you can go through and look at this reference, and, you know, you've got utilities. And so like you saw earlier, one of the things that I did on arrays is give me a unique array. And let's see, yeah, so that is this unique function for array. So I can say, you know, give me a unique array, and it will return me back that array. So if my array has 1, 2, 1, 4, 1, 3, it's going to give me back 1, 2, 4, 3 because it has removed the extra ones in that array. And so, so that's kind of what the unique does. So that's definitely a handy one to have, because sometimes you might have arrays that have the same thing in it multiple times, and you really only want to run through the uniques. And so that's what I use that. But there's other ones in here. So it's always good to know that the underscore library is included, and there's a bunch of utility functions in here that you can use. The other ones that are nice in underscore are debounce. And debounce, and let's look it up here real quick. Okay, debounce. So debounce is a way inside of underscore to say, hey, I only want to call this function one time every so often. So, you know, that way if somebody's clicking on a button or something that you've created and you've got custom JavaScript tied to that button click, and you don't want that same thing to fire 100 times because somebody got click happy, then you can actually call the debounce function to say only call it only call this function once every so often. So even if somebody clicks 100 times, I'm only going to actually call the function once. It's useful for, very useful for things like doing a resize of a window, like is the case here. You don't want that to happen for every pixel that somebody resizes the window. You don't want to call the same function. You just want to call it once every, say in this case, it's every 300 milliseconds. So if they once every 300 milliseconds do a recalculation of size, that's debounce, and that's included in underscore. And that's one that I've used quite a bit in different functions to not have an effect happen over and over again. When somebody takes an action, maybe only call it once after a certain period of time has elapsed, or once and then elapse a period of time before we look for it again. So hopefully that's helpful. Okay, so let's jump back in here, and let's, so far, if you all could just give me a thumbs up in the chat or unmute yourself and just say, yep, this is making sense so far, or if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. I'll answer them as I can. Dan says we're good, awesome. So hopefully, the goal here was just to kind of walk through some of the foundational elements, and then, and Jeremy says keeping up so far, awesome. And so I just want to lay some of the foundational elements, some of the things to be aware of, that these are things that exist across the board in programming languages, and specifically for us in JavaScript and jQuery. So, so that okay, I know I can do a for loop. What's the syntax on a for loop? So then you can just go in and say, hey, Google, give me the syntax for a JavaScript. Oh boy, for loop. And so we get a JavaScript for loop. And Dan mentioned W3 Schools earlier. Stack Overflow, again, great references, W3 Schools. I think we talked about this last week not last week, but last session about custom CSS. W3 Schools is an awesome reference for JavaScript, for CSS, for all kinds of programming. Actually, it started out, when I started using W3 Schools, it was just HTML. And then they expanded into CSS and JavaScript. And now they've got pretty much anything that have to do with programming, and especially web-based languages included here. But so to give you the references for JavaScript loops. And so again, we've got different kinds of loops. So we've got, for JavaScript, we've got for, we've got for in, we've got for of, we've got whiles, we've got do whiles. And so there's, all these kinds of different loops, and they'll give you the actual structure. So again, so we've got for, statement 1, statement 2, statement 3. And so here's again a reference, kind of like what we looked at, is for I equals 0 and I is less than 5, I plus plus. So that's going to loop through 5 times and output the text, or it's going to add to the text. The number is whatever and break, and then it's going to output it, that you can then output that text later. And so, and then you've got different, different things that you can do here with the different sorts of for structures. And then let's see. So these are all kinds of different ones. The for in loop. So for X in person, this would be, for, so this is going to loop through this object, person, and it's going to loop through the X is actually the different attributes. And so this is going to say grab the value, the text plus equals the person X. So grabbing the value of the X, which in this case, the first time through, it's going to be F name. The second time through, it's going to be L name. The third time through, it's going to be age. And so it's going to add to this, it's going to be text plus equals John, text plus equals Doe, text plus equals 25. So that's what this loop's going to do. So it's something, kind of good to know there. The for of loop is, going to loop through and do something very similar to that up above. And, here's some examples. So, we can go through and look at this array. And then it's going to grab that, it's going to set this variable equal to the value of this this array value. So it's going to loop through each of those elements in the array. It's going to set that to X and then write the X. You can loop over strings. A string is actually an array. Actually, that's a good one we should put down in here as well, because variables are variables, but arrays are a type of variable container. So we'll talk about arrays as well. And then let's talk about let's talk about objects, since you're going to reference those quite a bit inside of JavaScript. And all kinds of languages, actually. So arrays are sometimes called a hash. And then we've got objects, and objects have properties, which are sometimes called attributes. And so we can see here, you know, that we're going through those things. And again, we've got while loops. And so this one actually, let's go to the next page. I'm not sure why this doesn't look quite complete. So yeah, so here's our while loop. So an example of while I is less than 10. Then, you know, this is similar to what we did with the for loop earlier, only this is a little different way to do it. So you're actually increasing the value of I from within the loop. So while I is less than 10, then do this, do the work that's inside here. So it starts out, so you would probably, what they don't show here is that you should set that variable of I up above, I equals 0 or something like that. And then, so while I is less than 10, then, you know, set the text to the number is whatever the value of I is in this current iteration, and then increase its value by 1. And so, but this could be, doesn't have to necessarily be an entire evaluation here. It could be just a variable, and you could set that variable equal to true or false here. This is just looking to say, while this evaluation is true, then do the work within. And once this evaluation returns false, then stop doing the work. And then the alternative of that is the do while, is that says, and so the do is always going to execute at least one time. It's very similar to the while loop. The while loop just may never execute if this statement isn't true the first time through. The do is always going to execute at least one time, and then while this is true, it's going to do it again. And so the just slight different variations of pretty much the same thing. So we've got whiles and do whiles. Whiles are the most popular version. You'll use those the most often, but do while is something to keep in mind as far as an option. So I'm going to go ahead and throw those in as our different types of loops. We did while loops, and we'll throw do while in here as well. And then we've got we have our for in and for of JavaScript types of loops there. And so great reference here. So this is what I often have to do is just say, okay, I know I can do a loop. I know I want to do a while loop. I might need to go and look up the proper syntax for that. Or I know I want to do a for loop because I want to count through this 10 times. I can do this as a for, I could do it as a while. So let me go look up the syntax and just do a Google search for the syntax. But it's important to start with knowing what's possible to do based on your constructs. And then from there, you can always look up the syntax. You know, so there's a lot of different ways that you can do that thing. One other thing I'm going to throw in here before I forget about it, and that is, and we'll get to it in just a little bit, but we're going to put in here try catch blocks. And so that try catch is, hey, I want to try doing something, and as long as that thing doesn't fail, then go ahead and do it. But if it fails, I want to catch the failure so I don't actually just bomb out. I don't cause an error to happen, which causes my code to stop executing. So try catch is a safety net to keep your code from actually bombing out and causing your page to stop functioning properly. So we'll go through those in a little bit as well. But W3 Schools, great reference. Google, great reference. And a great way to find references on specific libraries like Countdown or a Moment. I reference the moment.js library documentation quite often and trying to do different things, calculate different times, what kind of, you know, what are my formats. So like if I go and look up Moment, go and look up moment.js, then it'll find me the docs for moment.js. And then you can actually go in and it will show you, hey, here's all the ways to include Moment. It's already included in ClickFunnels, so you don't have to do that. And these are the different things you can do. Okay, so you can parse times, you can parse strings. You can get the current timestamp just by calling now. You can, give it a string and it'll turn it into an actual date object you can work with. And so here's the different string formats you can pass in that it knows how to parse. You can format a string into a date, you know, or you can tell it this is the string and this is the format of my string. So these are the parts of the date. So this is a good reference a lot of times, is to say, okay, what do I want to define something as, you know, year, day, month. How do I do that? Well, here's your reference of which letters represent which part of the year or the date or the time. So here's all the different things: week, year, and weekday tokens. Here's your locale tokens. Here's your hours, minutes, seconds tokens, your time zone tokens. So you know how to signify that format. So I don't try and memorize these at all, because there's a lot of different ways to do that. So, but you can come in and actually know that you can go to the reference. You just need to know, hey, there's a token that represents a long date format, LLLL. I just need to go and remember what I need to go and look up what that token is, so I can actually output it. And so that's what I did when I wrote this code for the CF date replace pro. You can see here that I've got a long date format is one that you can output. So I've got, okay, I know I can format this date, this moment, I can format it, and I just need to pass in what my format is I want returned, and it will do that. I've also got one called long dash date, or I actually have one where I can give it, I'm defining my own format here, and I'm passing in all these variations. So the day, DDDD, is the full day name. Month, MMMM, is the full month name. D is just the single digit day number. So instead of being 06, that would be DD. It's just a single digit if it's a single digit, or a double digit if it's a 2-digit, like 13, and then a 4-digit year. So I know that all of these things are combinations that I can find in here, and it will tell me what all of those things mean and how do I get them. So the day of the month, you know, 1 to 31, day of the month with an ordinal. So that'll come, you know, D underscore, or lowercase o is kind of nice. It'll be first, or it'll be second to ND. It knows how to calculate the ordinals. So yeah, so there's all kinds of cool things that you can find inside the documentation. So those are important things to just know what your constructs are, what's included, and then know that you've got the power of Google and these references at your hands. W3 Schools, Stack Overflow, the actual library documentation in Moment is very, very good. It's one of the libraries that we use quite a bit. The library documentation in Countdown is decent. It takes a little bit of figuring out sometimes, but at least you understand what are the different functions that I can call on my Countdown. How do I pass in a new option value? How do I change an option value name? How do I retrieve an option value to see what it currently is? There's different ways to do this thing. So just know that looking up your reference is going to be your friend. So, okay, so let's jump, let's close some of these things down, and just know that when we need to look them up, we'll know how to go and look them up. So let's talk about arrays, because we didn't really talk about arrays. Arrays are a grouping of multiple values. And so an array would be, you know, say you want to create an array of animal types, then, you know, you would have, you know, something like dog, cat, llama, horse, pig. Okay, so this is an array of animals. It's just a set of things, right? And so these are string values. Each one of these is a string. So you can have an array of strings. You can have an array of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So these numbers could represent a value of something. So they could be the counts. They don't have to be in sequence. They could be, you know, the first person that bought spent $100, second person spent $200, third person spent $3, the fourth person spent $404, and the fifth person to go through spent $50. So, you know, this could be an array of purchase values. You know, you might need to grab those for some reason. You could do that. So this is just an array of numbers. You can also have, in JavaScript, you can have an array of mixed things. So you can have dog, 100, 75, cat, and then you could even have a variable, x, in there. And you could store all these things. They're just, JavaScript is an object-oriented language, and it's loosely defined. So you can, you don't have to say, hey, this is an array of strings in advance. It's just an array of stuff. It's an array of objects, and a string is an object. A number is an object. A variable can be a string or a number, and so it can be stored here. So this is just an array of stuff. And so then that gives you a way to store that collection of stuff so that you can reference it later. And then what we can do is say, okay, so that's an array of stuff. So I'm gonna say my array equals dog, or let's say my animals equals dog, cat, horse. Okay, so that's my array of animals, right? And so, well, what if I want to output, I want to grab whatever's stored in my second animal spot. In JavaScript, arrays are what we call zero indexed, which means if you want to reference the first element, it's actually element 0, element 1, and element 2. So I would just say my animals, and then I would give it a number, an index number. So my animals 1 is equal to cat. My animals 0 is equal to dog, and my animals 2 is equal to horse. So this is the index of the number in my array. So my animals is an array. So I can say, okay, well, I want to grab my second, I want to grab actually my third element. I want to grab my element that's in index 2, which is actually my third index, my third element. I want to grab its value. So that's how you would do that with an array in JavaScript. And so that's kind of an array structure. Hashes, you really don't, they're not called hashes inside of JavaScript. That's more of a Rails or a Java way of kind of managing arrays, and those are generally referenced as more named arrays. But in JavaScript, you can also name things. I'm actually going to do this one inside of a new script window here, and I'm just going to I have a little shortcut that creates this as JavaScript. So in this one, I'm going to say var my object equals, and in this case, we could do the curly brackets is the way you would define an object inside of JavaScript. And this gives us the ability to have named associations within this. And so we can say, so this one you saw earlier, something like first name, last name, age. So, so we could call this my person. So in this case, my person first is equal to Jamie, and then a comma, and then last is equal to Smith, and then age is equal to 45. And so this is an object reference here, an object definition, where first, and you'll notice that I don't have this in quotes because it's a simple definition of just one word, no special characters, no nothing weird. It's not a number. You can do that without the quotes, but you could also do the same thing and have quotes around it. And you could do single quotes or double quotes there. And then a colon. So this is the name of this element, or this, what we'll call an attribute or a property on this object. This is the name of that property. This is also called the key. So within this object, the key of first has a value of Jamie. So this is the name of your key. And so, and then the colon, what comes after the colon is the actual value. And so, so the key of first has a value of Jamie, the key of last has a value of Smith, and the key of age has a value of 45. So in 45 here is a number. If we store this with quotes, it's actually the string 45. Without the quotes, it's the actual integer 45. So it's important to know the difference of those things inside of JavaScript, because you can do math on a number, you can't do math on a string. Or if you do, it's not actually going to turn out the way you think that it will. So, it's important to know, and you can evaluate these things. So, so when you're looking at something like if saying, oh, if my person dot age less than 45, something like that, you say, hey, if my person's age is less than 45, then output holy cow to the data log. Then you can do that with an integer. But if you made this a string, that's not going to evaluate to the same thing, because then it's the string 45. So it's going to try and evaluate the math, add up the characters, and determine whether the characters are greater than 45. And that's not necessarily going to evaluate the way that you think it will. You would first have to convert this string. You would have to parse it and then turn it into an integer to do the comparison here. So it's important to know the difference between strings and numbers when you store them in JavaScript. So anything when you put quotes around it, whether it's single quotes or double quotes, those things are strings. And the math on those is not the same as if you didn't have the quotes around them. And it's a number here. But at the same time, if I don't put quotes around Smith, then I'm going to get all kinds of error, because that's not a valid value, because that's considered an array, or I'm sorry, a variable name. It's looking for a variable name called Smith. Just like this is a variable, it's looking for a variable name Smith, or a function named Smith, something that's defined that's an abstract thing called Smith, and I don't find that anywhere. So I'm going to throw an error saying, hey, you're trying to reference something called Smith that doesn't exist. And so it's just going to throw an error in your code. So if you want to use the string Smith, you have to surround it with quotes of some variation or another, single quotes or double quotes. And so those are the kind of things that you'll need to be aware of for object representation. Another important thing that is important to note with this object representation is that this is, in some languages, this would be called an associative array, where you can actually have names. So like in PHP, you could have PHP, and we could have an array that is just, you know, we could have this be, okay, my strings, key 1 equals value 1. And it's not going to color code right here, because this is considering it's HTML, not PHP. But this says, hey, for key 1, which would be key 1, here's the value. So it's a little different way of doing the same thing, but in PHP it's called an associative array. It's actually a named keys and then values associated with those things. So this is the way we do associative arrays. So if you ever have to look up something like that, just know that associative array is a term that's sometimes interchanged with this object notation here inside of JavaScript. And so we've got this set up, but there's a couple different things that we have here. So age works well with this dot notation for an object. So an object, you can reference its properties by having the dot. So we could say my person dot last, my person dot first, and those will reference those things by those attributes as properties by name. But in some cases, you need to have a plus in here, first name, or you know, a space in here. Well, you can't have for last space name. That is not a valid key because it's got a space in it. Your keys cannot have a space in it in this representation. We can do that with quotes around it, because you can have a string that represents the key name, but you can't have a key name without quotes that has a space in it. So what we would have to do there, if we want to grab first name as my key value, I can't use myperson.first space name, because that's also not valid. But what I can do is now, instead of using the dot notation, is actually go in and use our array notation, which is our square brackets, and then put the quotes in there. So this is our key name here. So we can actually reference it that way. And so it'll pull that value for that first name field. And so, so those are important things to know. There's different ways to access these variables based on what you need to store. And so it's important to know, sometimes it is valuable to store these things in this way. You might want to output both the key and the value. And so if you need to do that, your keys you might want to have them be a little friendlier. And sometimes you're defining things about an object and you don't know in advance what the key name is going to be, because you're looping through something else, and it may have it may have values that can't be stored as a key name without using the quotes. And so you're going to actually, you don't maybe know what those key names are yet. And so you can use this array notation to get at those keys. So it's two different ways to get at the exact same piece of data. So that's an important thing to note, the difference of when it comes to JavaScript. You have array notation, you have object notation, and then you have, this would be a general object way of getting things, dot notation, and then you have, this is our array notation, but you can access the same thing. So just because something is an object like this doesn't mean you can't use the array notation to get at the keys. These keys, and then also you can do this. So you can say my person 0 is also going to get that first key. And so, yeah, so there's lots of ways that you can get around that, those keys. And so it's important to kind of keep those things in mind, that there's different ways to access that data. So that's arrays. Is that kind of making sense as far as arrays? Those can be a little bit of a complex topic, but they're very, very important. And you'll see that when we do things like promo code, let's just pull, let's pull this one up. You can see here that I'm actually using a combination of arrays. And so we'll notice here that we've got the square brackets is an array. It defines that, hey, this thing that I'm including here is going to be an array of things, but an array of objects that include keys that include arrays. So it gets pretty ugly, a nested structure, but it gives me the ability to really define and fine tune the data that I have here, and know that if I give things a certain structure, then I can loop through this array and take action on each one of the things. And then I can loop through those keys and take action on the value of those things. And I can loop through those values and take action on those things. So this is the structure of the setup for how you define the data around promo codes. So we've got an array of promo code objects, and each of these represents a promo code. And within that promo code, we have the codes, and that's an array of codes. And then we have regular price products, and that's an array of products. So we can actually define 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 here. We can have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8. We can have an array of product IDs. We have a promo key that has an array of product IDs. And then we have a description that's just plain text. And so these are the way we define, our different, I configure my different add-ons is by nesting and combining these structures of arrays and objects, and even arrays within those object keys. The other thing that we might notice here is that when we're using single quotes, we need to be careful of if we need to use we have the concept of quotes and we have the concept of apostrophes when it comes to the English language. But as far as code's concerned, they're the exact same thing. It's the same character on the keyboard. even though they may represent something different. This is an apostrophe in President's Day. It's also a single quote. And so if we don't identify that specially inside of this single quote, then it's just ending this previous single quote. And we'll notice now that our code highlighting has gone haywire because it's not looking at the first and the last single quote. It's looking at the first and the next single quote. So that ends our quote. So this in the green, that's a valid string, but what's outside of it here is not a valid string. So, but if we do this, the backslash, then that actually escapes this and just says, hey, just evaluate this as for what it is. It's just a single quote by itself. It is not part of this quote pair. The other option is, in that case, just do double quotes around, because you can have strings with double quotes, and then you could just have a single quote and that'll be just fine. That single quote then is not going to cause any problems. So that's another way around that. If you ever run into cases where, man, I really need to use a single quote in this, but I've got single quotes already, just swap out your quote types. And strings can be either single quotes or double quotes, and then it's what's within them that is important. So those are kind of some important gotchas that I run into every once in a while that people aren't always aware of, is how do I deal with those single quotes. So backslash will take care of the problem. It escapes that. You know, just switch out your code or your quote types. So yeah, so is that kind of all making sense so far? Arrays and kind of objects and properties and attributes on those objects, and how those things work. If you could just give me a yay in the chat, or yep. Okay, Dan says yep, doing good. Okay, good. And then one other thing that is important to note is if we're looking at this, the other thing that we can do is to even combine these things even further is we have functions and we have methods, we have variables. So, you know, we could have age, we could have birthday. We can have that be equal to, oh, and I have to have a comma. That's the other thing that we'll notice here, is that each of these is separated by a comma, just like our array. So if we were doing this as var my person equals an array, and it's Jamie Smith 45, and we could say, you know, 0804 1974. Oop. Then that's how we represent this in array, but now we don't have the benefit of the named keys, right? So that's why we do this as object notation. So we can say, hey, if I want to pull up just my person's age, I can go straight to that by name instead of saying, oh, well, I know age is always the third key. So I've got to grab key 3 or the value of that's in index, my third index, and grab its value. We don't have to remember that. We can just do it by name. Because these things may not always, you know, we may be programmatically adding these values and we may not know whether it's going to be the third element. So we want to do it by age here. We want to do it by name. But we could add, so that's just kind of the difference between object notation and array notation. But for this one, we want to say, hey, birthday, I may have this defined up above and may say var my birthday equals, and it could be a string, 08, 04, 1974. I could have that defined there. And I just might say my birthday is equal to, or the birthday is equal to my birthday. So now that's a variable. So that variable grabs the variable value and assigns it to this key. So we have variables stored there. The other thing we can do is we can have something like callback. If we have an object and we want to say, hey, after I do something on this object, I have a function, or we just call this, say, my function. And we can actually define a function here. And so now we have an anonymous function within this object called my function. And so now if we wanted to ever output to the console, we want to call yay, I call the function, then we can actually just say my person dot my function and call it, and it's actually going to call that function. And so we can store all kinds of things inside of this object notation. And so that's kind of how, you know, this objects works. We can, you know, arrays work. So you'll notice this structure sometimes within, let's see, we've got another one, slider. So slick slider. So inside of slick slider, let's see, you know what? I don't think I have it contained within here. I think of another one where we actually have a function stored on different things. But you know, this is something that you might notice in other libraries as you're using them, and you might notice them. You know, so it's good to kind of understand that, okay, I can pass in a function call to a key, and then I can actually use that, you know, later on. And it could be based on, and this can actually call, you know, and use variables from this same object inside of this function. So it's kind of a cool way to have things self-contained. So just some, you know, important notes, kind of some foundational stuff there. So some examples. And let's see here. And so I think that pretty much covers, as long as you guys are, is this, I definitely, I know Dan said, yep, we're doing good. Is this all making sense? Is it useful so far? Do you feel like you're getting a good kind of understanding of foundation? Because what I don't want to do is get past this foundational stuff and then get into the, you know, kind of deeper examples and then have it really not be sunk in. So if I could just get a quick thumbs up from everybody, yep, this is making sense and this is helpful. That'd be great. I'm going to take a quick drink here. Give everybody a second. Yep, Dan says making sense.
Hey, Jamie, I wonder if you could just really quickly, I think this would be accurate, explain how when you call that my function key, you could put a variable in for the function that would insert into what you print to your console log.
Okay, so you're wanting to say, so grab, you know, say a variable name from here and output that into the log. So, and this would be one of the cases where I would actually probably test this and look up the exact syntax. But off the top of my head, I believe what we would do in that case is say this dot, say we want to output birthday, then we would output this. And I would probably do something like my birthday as a string here, and put a space and then do a plus. Oh, there we go. So let's actually just try this. So we're going to call my person. This is another cool thing, and we'll actually go through. And so my person dot my function. I believe that's the way we need to call this. And so let's do this. So we're going to grab these things. And I'm going to go into, I'm just going to go into a page here. And I don't think we have any jQuery here at all. So we don't have to have that jQuery. So I'm just going to call, let's open up our inspector here. So we're inside of a browser. We've got a page on it. And we just got some JavaScript code. And we want to run this JavaScript code and see what happens. And so I'm just going to paste in that code. And then I'm going to hit this. And you'll notice that that's what's happened here. Is so now I've had code that set my birthday. I created my person object. I created a my function key, and then I called my person.myfunction, and I call that function, and it output to the log, the console.log. That method actually prints to this console log. I printed my birthday colon plus my colon space, and then a plus, which means, hey, take whatever this value is and add it onto the string, this dot birthday, and I get the value of 8/4/1974. So this dot birthday represents the birthday key of the current object. So this represents the current object, and birthday equals the key on that current object. So that's how you would do that. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, that's cool. What I was thinking is where it's got my person.myfunction parentheses. Could you put something in that parentheses that
absolutely
into that statement?
Yep, absolutely. So we could do something like yay. And so then, but what we would do then is within this function, we would take that. We would take param1, and then we would output param1. And so now we can go and we can run that same thing. And we would output that. And now we output yay instead. So we're passing a parameter value into my parameter, and this function is defining what parameters I want to pass in, and then I just use that same value here as a variable name.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was. I thought that I was correct, you know, but I wanted to actually see
Sure.
it in action.
Yep, sure. Yeah, so yeah, and that's kind of the cool thing about this is there's lots of different things that you can do with this, and there's lots of different ways that you can define things. You know, another thing that you could do that you'll see and done a slightly different ways is the other thing is you don't have to set these keys up all in advance. So that's one thing we have here is we've set up all these keys, right? And so we could, but we can also say, okay, var my person equals just an empty object. I want to say, hey, this is an object. And then we can say my person dot first equals Jamie. My person dot last equals Smith. And then my person dot my function equals, and then do my function here. And then, you know, console log param1. And then we could output my person dot my function. Okay. So just a slightly different way of doing the same thing. And now if we go in and let's refresh this page to kind of reset everything. Now if we paste in that code, if I did my, don't have any syntax errors. Yeah, so now we basically are doing the same thing, but gives us a slightly different way of setting this thing up. So we started with an empty object and then we've added keys to it. So we can add keys. They don't have to be predefined in advance. We can add keys to it. The other thing we can do is we can say, you know, in this case, my person first equals Amy. And so that was defined out of the box as a first key, but then I want to change that. And now it's going to be Dan. So now we've started with something. And now I might want to say, in this case, I'm going to output this dot first. So now we can go in and say, okay, so I started out, my first name was set to Jamie, and then in code, I updated that to Dan, and now let's see what we get output here if we go and run this again. And so now it's going to output Dan because I overwrote the value of my first key here with a new value of Dan. And then again, I'm calling this dot first. So it's grabbing this is the current element that I'm working on, the object that I'm in. And then I'm going to grab the first key off of that and output its value. So yeah, so just a few different kind of structural ways that are doing kind of the same thing, but depending on what your logic is doing in your code, will modify how you actually need to use these things and group them together. You may not know what your keys are right off the bat, so you may not be able to define them up here. You may not know what the values are yet, but you may be looping through something and adding keys and adding values based on something else on the page. So, and for example, as I go through and say if we pull up our order summary, let's grab our latest version of this one. So we'll grab this one and let's turn this to HTML. So on this one, as part of the rebuilding the order summary, I actually go through and I create a new object called cart prods. And I'm looping through, I'm going in here and I'm saying, hey, go to the CFAR form on this page, and we'll go through some specifics on this one, maybe in the next session, because we're already at 2 hours. I think we'll probably end up splitting this for sure into multiple sessions. But it's looping through, it's going to the CFAR form, which is kind of a hidden form. And I think we went through this last time. There's a hidden form on every ClickFunnels page called the CFAR form, and it stores things like the products that are on the order. It stores things like the affiliate ID of the person that sent the traffic. It stores things like the first name, last name, email address, all that stuff gets stored there. And then when you submit that form, whether it's an opt-in or an order form or an OTO page, when an action gets taken to actually store that data, that form gets submitted to the back end of that page so that the data actually gets stored in the database. So in this case, I know that when somebody purchases a product, that product gets added to the CFAR form, and the field that actually stores that value, it's an input field, and it has a name of purchase, product IDs, and then this is, again, it's an array notation. So this tells Rails on the back end that this field could contain multiple values, and so to process them as an array. So I have an array of product IDs here. So, and look for the ones that are checked. This colon checked is a pseudo selector in jQuery. This doesn't work in CSS. So this is one of the ones that works in jQuery but doesn't work in CSS, is this colon checked. So jQuery knows how to find items that are checked. CSS doesn't necessarily know that. So find me all the checked product IDs on my CFAR form and go through each one of them and call this function on it. So we've got an anonymous function here, and this anonymous function is going to first take this, which is the $ this is saying, hey, jQuery, work on my current element. So whatever element you selected here, the each, it means it's working on one element at a time. So this means grab the current one that we're working on and grab its value. So we know we have an input field here, so it's going to grab its value, which is going to equate to some number. And then if the cart prods, which is an array I have up above, or it's an object. So cart prods is an object. If it has own property, meaning does this object have a property of product ID? So if I've already, if I know this one already exists in this object, then I just need to add one to its quantity. Otherwise, I need to create on cart prods, I need to create a key and set its quantity equal to 1. And so otherwise, I just need to update its quantity and add one to it. So this gives me a way to say, for each different product ID on this order, figure out what the quantity is. And so as I loop through these items, either add one to the existing quantity, or if it doesn't already exist on the order, then just set a quantity equal to 1. So this is kind of a way to loop through and search within this object and set values on the object. And then I use these things then to go through later and say, okay, now go through each one of my cart prods, each one of the items in there, and find its quantity, find its product ID, and then loop through those and then do some work on that. So yeah, so lots of cool things that you can do with products and jQuery, and kind of combining these things. So yeah, so hopefully that's making sense, and is you can kind of see the power of these things and these combinations of the different constructs that we have, especially when you combine them with the power of jQuery, which is find me elements on the page and take some action on those things. Like just for this example, which is like, hey, find me all the products that are already attached to this order form and loop through them, and then store the information about them. So then I have a structure that then I can loop through later and take some specific action on those things. So this is kind of a good example of that combination of our basic constructs with jQuery and with a little bit of ingenuity and creativity on the logic side of things, and being able to do add the magic to the page that doesn't already exist. Okay, so we've kind of went through that. We've kind of gotten our, our basics here. We've talked about objects, properties, attributes. They're very similar to arrays, but you can see that we do have a little bit different way when it comes to objects. In this case, I need to find out, does this product ID already exist? So I have this, a different function called hasOwnProperty. This is built into JavaScript. And so I can, just call that to see, does this key exist? So that's what we're calling it, a property here. So that's why it's kind of important to know when it comes to objects, what are the things on those? So, we call those keys, we can call those properties, and see if I can get back to my example code here. So we'll call these properties as what they're often referenced as well. So as you're looking through, and again, you can go through and just do a quick Google and say, JavaScript does object have property, which is exactly, properties or property, and how to check if an object has properties in JavaScript. It's going to go to Stack Overflow, which is very common. And then you can see, oh, okay, great. So, I can loop through each, hey, I've got an AD as my object here. So I can say for var prop in add, if add.hasOwnProperty prop, then do something. So this is how you could loop over those things. So this is the for in loop that we talked about earlier. For every prop in add, if add has own property prop, then it goes through. So so this is kind of just a quick way to know that, okay, I know these things exist. Now, what's the syntax I need? What's the structure I need to put them in? And hit up Google, and Google will help you find these things. It does not, in my opinion, it does not make any sense to try and memorize the code. In fact, it's almost impossible to memorize every potential structure that you have. I've been doing this for 20 years, writing code, and I can tell you that I don't have any language memorized. We often have to look these things up to find the things that you want. What's important to memorize is the concepts and the constructs. And then to commit to memory, things like, even within ClickFunnels, like, okay, I know ClickFunnels has certain structures of how they do things, how things are nested. I know that they use Bootstrap. So I know if I can find particular Bootstrap classes on the page, I know that I can use those for CSS. I know that they use Handlebar, or I know that they use Moment, and I know that they use Countdown. So I know that I can look those things up. Those are the things that are important to remember and to make note of, that, okay, there's a certain way of doing things within ClickFunnels, and as long as I can remember those things, then I know I can go look up the syntax for how to use those things together with each other. Okay, so I think we've pretty much, and Dan says, if you memorize a language, they will change it all tomorrow. Yeah, absolutely. JavaScript has changed dramatically since I first started learning it 20 years ago. At first, and HTML has changed. We're now in version 5 of HTML. So it's changed dramatically. The elements that exist now didn't exist 20 years ago, and a lot of the elements that existed 20 years ago don't exist today inside of HTML. And so, yeah, things change all over. Yeah, and exactly. CSS is on version 3 now, and they're already working on version 4. So things constantly change when it comes to the web, and they constantly change when it comes to programming. And there's always new languages coming out. There's always new libraries coming out. So definitely makes no sense to try and memorize those things. It's just more important to know the concept. And that's why we often call things pseudocode. So that's why you see me writing here things like, if this equals true, do this. This is not code. This is not valid. We could not evaluate this, but it's a pseudocode that you can say. And this is where, even if you're going to take this information and use it to hire somebody else to write the code for you, if you understand the constructs, you can actually go in and do pseudocode, where you can say, okay, basically I need a program that does something like, if this, if my name equals Jamie, then do some work else, do some other work. And so you can, pass that off, and you could, you could define this work a little bit better, store, or, you could say, oh, split the name into pieces. And then otherwise, just store the value. And you could say if my name, and you could even do something like, oh, if my name dot contains a space, then split the name into pieces. Otherwise, just do store the value. So you could hand that off to somebody and say, hey, this is just pseudocode, but this is kind of what I want to have happen. I know this is possible. I don't know what the syntax for a dot contains is in JavaScript exactly, but basically I want to say, hey, I've got a variable, I've got my variable, my name is equal to, $sign, it's going to be input, name equals name. And so, just figure out whether my name contains a space. And if it does, split the name into pieces. Otherwise, just store the value that you have. So this is just some pseudocode, but you could hire a custom, hire a developer and say, hey, this is basically what I need to do. I don't know exactly the syntax, but here's kind of the concept of what I need to have happen. And they're already going to be light years ahead of where they need, where you want them to be. It's going to take much, much less time to get that work done because they're like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. I can figure out the syntax for you. You don't have to know that, but now I know exactly what you want to have happen. So you can take these things, these constructs, and even if you just write out pseudocode, which isn't valid code in any given language, but it's close enough for a developer to take and say, okay, yeah, I can take your pseudocode and make it actual working functional code. So that's the other thing that we can do with these constructs. Even if you never use it to write a line of your own custom JavaScript, you can at least use the constructs and the concepts in the basics to write out pseudocode that you can hand off to somebody else, or even to build it out for structure for yourself. Start with, and a lot of times I will start with something like this as just pseudocode, and just, I need to do a brain dump for myself, a brain dump of, okay, what do I want this thing that I'm writing, what do I want this program or this custom add-on to do? I'll write it out as pseudocode first. Basically, okay, yeah, I need to grab a few pieces. So I'll start with, okay, let's define out what my variables are. Variable, I got my variable one. I need to store several different things. I need to store their last name. So I'll do that, very first name. Okay, I want to grab that because I'll need that for something else. I want to grab their, shirt size. So let's grab that, and I'll figure out where to grab that at later, but at least I need to know these things. And then I need to figure out from there, okay, if the shirt size is small, then I probably want to do something different than if it's a large. Or if they didn't fill in a shirt size, I need to make sure I have that. So I want to make sure if my shirt size is empty, if it's still empty, then I need to display an error on the page or display a message that says you have to select a shirt size. So you can kind of go through and write those things out as pseudocode, and then jump in and look at the specifics of the page and say, okay, now how am I going to actually put this selector on the page? Because this may change. I may not have a selector yet. So I may start with, name equals shirt size, but that may not actually be the name of that input yet. I may know that, yeah, I want to kind of basically grab a value of the shirt size field, but I don't know what shirt size is actually going to be called yet. So then when I get into actually building out my funnel, I'll know, okay, once I grab and insert my custom input, then I need to grab the name I use there, and then I'll put it in here, and then that'll work. So, but I start with pseudocode just as let me lay out the framework of what I'm trying to accomplish, and then I'll go back and clean it up and make it actually function. So, so that's what we do with constructs. We kind of, build out these things. We can use it to, we know we've got all these things at our disposal. So we can kind of set them up, and we can then use them as pseudocode and go through and make them actually functional from there. Just one thing that we didn't cover that we'll want to cover real quickly, and this is one where I actually, every time that I need to use this, I actually go and I look up the reference on how to do it. Switch is the same way. Switch is, I always go and like, oh man, I always forget what exactly is the syntax structure for a switch inside of JavaScript. because a switch in JavaScript is structured slightly differently than a switch inside PHP, is slightly different than a switch inside of Java, it was slightly different than a switch inside of C#. So the syntax of them is always slightly different, but I know that they exist. Try catch is the same way. But let's walk through the actual try catch statement and see what that is. And again, I mentioned try catch is just it's kind of a safety net. It's like, I want to try and do this thing, but if this thing fails, I don't want it to bring down the whole house of cards. I just want to then gracefully exit. And I'll do this thing a lot of times if I'm trying to call out to an external service, like if I'm doing an AJAX call to Firebase or some sort of external service, or I'm trying to submit the existing, the item that's currently on the page. Say I'm trying to submit the opt-in form as it is to ClickFunnels via the back end. That may fail. I may not be able to get to the back end, or they may not have the right data, or may return some sort of an error to me. But I don't want my whole page to stop functioning as a result, or I don't want the rest of my code to not function. So I'll wrap that in a try catch block. So I'm going to say, hey, I want to try and set my person dot age equal some undefined variable. So I want to try that. And if this fails for some reason, I'm going to catch, and we're just going to call this E. This is just the error that's being thrown that's stopping this thing from happening. So we're going to try to call these functions. And if for some reason an error is encountered, then I want to catch that error, and then I want to do something. So then we can just say, hey, console log my E. And E will usually have properties on it. So usually there's going to be a message on the error. So E.message is going to output the message of that error. But the first thing what I would try and do is actually output the E and see what that is. And then from there, you could also console log individual elements within that. So we can console log E.message. And so, so in this one, we could say, okay, so let's go ahead and say my person. So we're going to define my person. So we're going to define my person. And then let's just try and run this. And now if I go back into here, let's just refresh this page. And right now I can see in my code, I'm trying to set my person.age, which is totally legit. It's not defined yet, but I want to set it. So it's going to add that key, but I'm going to set it to some undefined variable. Well, some undefined variable is just that. It's an undefined variable. So JavaScript's not going to be happy about that. So it's going to throw an error. So I want to try and run that and see what happens. And so I've got that here. And now, it's going to tell me some undefined variable is not defined. And so that's my message. So this is my E that's being logged. And this is the message of that. So this whole reference error piece is my actual E that's being spit out. And this is the message part of that. So, but it didn't stop everything else from functioning. So if I put something after this and say console log, yay, I reached this. And let's say I didn't put this try catch in here. I'm just going to comment these things out. So these are some other important things to note is we've got comments. So there's a few ways to do comments inside of JavaScript. The // is a single line comment. So this comments out a single line. So you notice this line is grayed out, but this line is not. Because I put a // it comments out a single line. If I put a /*, it's actually considered a multi-line comment, and then // ends that multi-line comment. So now I've got just one comment start here. Let me actually get rid of these. And so now I'm saying, okay, so comment out starting here until here. I want everything commented out. And I actually shouldn't do this. I need to do it this way. So there we go. I need it to be after that bracket. Otherwise the bracket would be outside and throw an error. So right now I just have my person is defined. My person.age, I'm trying to set it to some undefined variable. And then I want to output to the console. If I get to this point, I want to say, yay, I reached this. So let's try and run this. And now if I refresh this page and I go in here and I spit this out, notice I never got a message that says, yay, I reached this. All I get is an uncaught reference error. Some undefined variable is not defined. So this statement that I really wanted to happen, this console log, I really needed that to happen. It never happened because I hit an error first. So that's where that benefit of the try catch comes in. So I'm going to try this. And if it doesn't work, that's okay. I'm just going to output some things, but I still want to reach this. So now if I go in and I put this in here and I catch this, and now I'm going to try and run it. Now I can spit out that an error happened. Hey, something bad happened, but I still reached that point in my code. I still hit my console. Yay, I reached this. The error didn't stop us from continuing on with the processing of our function. So that's a try catch, and that's the big benefit there is if you have things that need to happen regardless, or you have things that are maybe slightly dangerous that, hey, I don't know if this thing's going to exist yet. I don't know if I have a value for some undefined variable, or I know that I may hit an error with this thing. You might want to wrap it in a try catch statement. And you can actually wrap entire chunks of code in a try catch. You can have a lot of code in here. It doesn't have to be just a single thing. You can wrap an entire, a lot of code inside of that. You could also you could put all your code into a function and then just try and call that function here. So, we could call my function here, and pass in some parameter. And then, so now we're going to try and call, we got my function as defined down below here. And now this one might be, so now we might say my person dot age equals some undefined variable. So we'll get rid of it here. And now, so we could have a bunch more work being done in this function, but if this function is going to throw an error, we don't know. We think it should work, but it might throw an error. So, and if it does, I don't want to bomb everything out. And maybe I just want to put, this one, something bad happened. And I want to output the message of what happened. But now I'm going to go and I'm going to call this. So now if I go in and I hit this, now it's going to say, okay, I tried to call my function and send in the param, but my function returned an error. It threw an error, but I caught that error and I just output, hey, something bad happened. Param1 is not defined. And so, yeah, so I tried to insert param1. So it wasn't even the thing that I thought. It wasn't thrown here. It was thrown up here. I tried to insert param1. Param1's not defined anywhere. I didn't send in an actual value. And so it's telling me param1's not defined, but yay, I still reached this. So this is kind of the power of the try catch, is to bring a little bit of a safety net to your code for those times when you don't know if something's going to exist or not. And even if it does or doesn't, if some sort of error is being thrown, you might want to catch that error, do something different, or you might want to just at least not entirely fail and not stop the rest of your program from functioning. You just want to maybe output that so you can troubleshoot it, or maybe you just want to at least know that it happened so that you can go on and do something different. Okay, so those were kind of the foundations of those. Some other things that we've kind of seen as we go through this that are important. One other thing that we want to talk about here, and we'll do this up with variables, and we'll talk about scope. So we've probably seen now that we have functions, we have variables being defined here, and then we have variables being used within other functions. And it's important to have this, we have this concept of scope. We have this concept of layers of an application, especially when it comes to JavaScript. We've talked about anonymous functions. So this is an anonymous function that will bring in, has its own parameter that can be passed in. So we can pass in and use param1, but we can only use param1 inside of the concept of this anonymous function. If we reference param1 outside of this anonymous function, then nothing's going to happen because it was only defined as part of this anonymous function. So it's only scoped to within this function. So it can only be used within here. So let's call this a param2. Same thing here. We can use param2 inside here, but we can't use it. It's not available outside of this function because it's passed in here. So let's call this my param. And let's say this is var param1 equals Jamie. And then we're going to call my function param1. So now param1 is defined in the scope here. So we've set var, and so it's defined within the scope in this point. We have a function created here that's an anonymous function. This is a common way within jQuery to say, hey, run all of this code that's included within this anonymous function, run it only after the page is entirely loaded. But this is all included within an anonymous function. So this param1 is available inside of that scope. So we can use it here because it's defined up above as a variable. So we can use it here. We can use it to make this function call. But in here, the accepted param is called my param. Well, this is the value of my param. We're passing that in. So I can call it my param here. I can also say param1 here because param1 is defined outside of this scope. So it's available inside of this. But I can't call my param outside of here. So let's do this. So let's kind of show a reference of going to add these things to kind of make them easier to identify on the log when they're output. And so we've got param1 set up here. It's in this, it's not a global scope, but it's global as far as this function is concerned. So we can set that up. We can also say console log my person dot age. We'll say that's my person dot first, since we're passing in a name. That probably makes more sense. So we'll do this. Okay, so we'll output that. And so now we've got our variable defined here. We've got my function, we've got param1. I need to define my person, or that's not going to work. So I can say var my person equals. And so there we're good. So now let's try and run just this. We've got our param defined, and we've got my person defined, but my param is defined right here inside the scope of this function. It's not available outside of the scope of this function. So this call, though, is outside of this function. So I won't be able to call this variable. So that's going to throw an error when I try and run it. So let's go ahead and try and run this. And we can probably, we don't need the page, so let's make this big. So we're going to paste that in, and now we're going to call it. And you'll notice it tells me, okay, so it output param1, which was defined outside of this function, but it's available in the function because it was defined with var outside of here. So it's available inside. So something that was defined outside is available inside, but this was defined inside, so it's not available outside the function. And so that's why you get this uncaught reference here. My param is not defined, but I defined it. It's defined right here, but it's not defined in this scope. So that's what this error is saying, is that it's not been defined in this scope, so it can't be used. And so we have this level of scoping. And then we also have this level of scoping here. Above this, we can say, where my param equals yay. And so this now is available outside of this. So this has been scoped now globally. It's available on the entire page because this is set to be a global variable. It's outside of the scope of any function. It's outside of the scope of anything else that's going on. It's defined at the global scope. The other thing that we can do, and so if we just call this, we can say var my param equals yay. And now that's been defined. And now I can go in and say, okay, well, my param has been defined. So get to the right function of our code here. So now I can run this and I get no error. And the reason I get no error is because my param has been defined. But notice my param value here is yay. So I set my param is equal to yay up here, but here in my function, I have my param called, and then I'm setting, oh, this is actually set to param1, so that's good. So let's actually do this, and let's, so we'll set, call this internal my param. Okay, and then let's actually go back and let's reload this page. And so we get it now. We're getting a nice set, fresh set, right? This is brand new, reset. Nothing's been defined globally. So let's go ahead and define this globally. My param equal to yay. We're going to set that. And then now let's go down here and we're going to set param1 and my person. We're going to set these up and then we're going to output my param. So let's set these and we're going to call this. And now we can see here that the internal my param has a value of Jamie. And my person.h, which should be first, doesn't make a big deal, it's just our console log statement, but that's being set to Jamie. But yet when I output my param here, it's set to yay. So this one, again, is scoping. So this reference here to my param, because it's out, so we've got my param here, but we also got my param here, and we've got my param way up here. So this is the my param available at the global scope. This is the my param that's only available inside of here. And this one takes precedent over the global scope in the inside of this function. And so it's important to keep that in mind because this is not overriding that value. It's just when I call my param here, it's looking first at the local scope. So this is called the local scope. So it's first looking for a variable called my param available in the local scope. If it doesn't find one available called my param in the local scope, it will go up to the global scope and say, okay, do I have something available called my param at the global scope? And if I do, then use that. But first it finds a variable called my param in the local scope, and that local scope variable has a value of Jamie because I set it right here as param1, and that's what I passed into my function. So it's passing that param1 value of Jamie, and so that's why my person.first got set to Jamie, and my internal my param is being output as Jamie, which is what we see here. Internal my param has a value of Jamie, but then when I output my param here, it has a value of yay. And that's because this is saying, find me the global scope. variable. And that global scope variable did not get reset because I reset something here. It's outputting what's available on the global scope. So that's our concept of scoping, and making sure that you know, you're referencing variables. If you have variable names that you might use in multiple places, you need to make sure that the one that you're trying to reference and use is available in the right scope. And Dan says there's a way to set a global variable inside a function. I think we've done that. I think I've done that. Yeah, there absolutely is. And so what we would do here is if we wanted to reset that global scope variable here with inside of this local function, we could actually say window.myParam equals myParam. Okay, and so window tells us it's at a global scope. So look up to the window level, the global level, grab its myParam, and then reset it to the local scope variable of myParam. So now if we run this, so let's go back and reset this. Then we're going to run this. So we're going to set that global variable of myParam. We're going to set it to yay. And now we're going to go down here and we're going to call this code again. And now we're going to paste that in. And now we can see that all of the values are set to Jamie. Even the global scope is set to Jamie. And that's because I took that, reset the value of the global variable to my local version of that variable. And so now myParam is equal to Jamie because I redid that. So that's how we would reach up to a different scope and grab its value or reset its value. I can also say, in this case, I could set instead of resetting that, I could just use so now I've got, so let's go ahead and refresh this page and we'll run this example. So now we can say var myParam, and this is setting this up in the global scope. And now I'm going to go ahead and grab this code, copy that, and I'm going to run that. And now we can see, okay, so now we can see we set that to yay. I didn't reset it here. I just set, so I'm going to output my internal myParam value, which is Jamie, because I passed that in to my function. So I'm going to output that right here. That's my internal myParam. But then I'm also going to output my global variable value, which is yay. And here I set the first name actual to the global version of that by saying myPerson.first is equal to the window.myParam. And so that's why myPerson.first is now set to yay and not to Jamie, because I access the global scope, not my local scope version. And then I output that. And then my global is still set to yay because I output my global version here. Even though I didn't have to put window here, it's grabbing the one that's defined in the current scope, and the current scope is global. So window is the way to kind of access those global versions. You can also define them if you want to. Here, if I just put var myParam, it's defined, it's outside of any function, so it's global. And so I can also say window.myParam here, and that's defined global. I don't want to put the var in front of it or throw an error here. You don't define globally scoped variables with a var in front of them. Or window, you don't say window or var window dot, you just do window dot. Because window is already defined. So this is like a key on top of the window that's already defined. So you can't redefine window. So if you put var window, you're trying to redefine window and you can't do that. So it'll throw an error, but we can say window.myParam equals yay. The other thing we can do is actually define that within here. Say it doesn't already exist, but I want it to. Then I can say window.myParam my param equals yay. And now I don't have to have this code here. I might have a function where I wanted to find a window. I wanted to find a variable in one function that's available in all my other functions. So inside of that function, inside of my function here, I wanted to find this window variable that's available to all my other functions. And so we can say my, function, my other function, my param, and console.log window.my param. And so, and now we'll just call my other function. And we'll pass in the same parameter. Okay, so now we've got this function here that gets called first, defines my param variable with a value of yay. And then we can go here. And now we can just copy this. We haven't defined, so we're going to go ahead and clear this out. We're going to refresh it. And so we haven't defined a window scope variable of my param yet anywhere inside of this browser. It doesn't exist yet. But I'm going to call out to this my function that's going to define it. And then later I'm going to console and I'm going to output it at the global scope. And so let's paste that in. And now we can see that we didn't get any errors, and we actually get my param, which is this line right here. This console log statement was able to output that variable from the global scope because we defined window.myparam here. So it wasn't defined within the scope of this function. It's being defined in the global scope, and this call is in the global scope. So it finds that myparam variable in the global scope. And I also have just the function of yay, the method or the value of yay being output right here, because that's being called by this function. So this window.myparam is available inside of this function as well because it's at the global scope. Even though I defined it initially in here, I made this call to define this variable in here, I'm able to grab it from this other function as well because it's at the global scope. So hopefully that kind of covers scope. That's another very important piece of variables and functions and everything else. Scope is important. So, and actually I'm going to put scope outside of this. We're just going to, we don't want this to be inside of variables because it's important for both variables and functions and methods. Because functions can also be defined at different scopes. So you can have, a function that's defined. So this is an anonymous function. So we've got my function defined, right? So we've got this function in here called my function. So if I go outside of this scope, so if we can see here, so this is my function. It's an anonymous function. My function is defined within this. If I call my function and pass in a value of Jamie here, and I try and grab all this code, and let's run back here, and I try and run that. So I know my function exists because I created it. We can see it. It's right here, function, my function. So if I try and call my function, it's going to tell me my function is not defined. But I know I defined it, it's right here. But it's defined within the scope of this anonymous function. So I can't reach into that anonymous function and call that function because it's only defined within here. It's only available for use within the scope of this anonymous function. It's no longer, it's not available globally. So that's an important, but if I define my function param1 console log So now I've got a my function here, right? And I've got it defined. And it tells me it's going to output to the log that I'm in the global scope. So now let's grab this code. Let's refresh this. I'm going to pass that in. I'm going to call it. And now it's calling, I'm in the global scope. So now it's called my function because my function exists, right? But I also ran this other code in here that's calling my function, right? But none of that happened because it's inside this function. So it didn't call this my function. It called the global scoped my function. And so that's important to, it's important to note that, you know, the scope of those things applies to both variables and to functions. You can define a function within another function and it's only available for use inside of that, the function that's currently operating. We call that a private scope. And in some languages, you'll actually use keywords. Like in Java, you'll use a keyword to define a function as private, meaning that no one else can call it from external. So even if they've instantiated an object, it's only available to call from within that object. They can't call it directly by creating an object. They have to call it on the object itself. So it might be called, you might call that a private function. And you know, that's a term that can be used even in JavaScript, but we don't use the keyword private to actually define it. We just define it like a normal function. It's just if it's wrapped inside of another function or inside of an anonymous function, then it's considered to be private and only available in the scope of the currently running function. Okay, so I think that covers a lot. The other things that we've seen as we go through here, and we've talked about a little bit, we've talked about comments. We've talked about the different notations, dot notation. We've talked about array notation, which is our square brackets like this. We've talked about parameters and parentheses. Those are we use within after a function call. We can also use parentheses after if statements. So these are syntactical elements. We've got, you know, our normals of, you know, greater than, less than. We can say greater than or equal to 45. We can do other things like not equal to 45. The bang sign here, the exclamation point means not equal 45. And there's a big difference. One other thing that we want to talk about that's important is the difference between equals and equals equals. So equals is the setting of a value. We're saying in this version, myperson.age equals 45, meaning set myperson.age to 45. This version says, evaluate this to true if myperson.age is equal to the number 45. So equals equals is an evaluation of truthiness, and a single equals is actually an assignment. So this is an assignment operator versus a logical operator. So, and that's very important because this myperson.age equals 45 will always return true because it returns the setting of 45. So it returns 45 in this case. So you might not ever notice that this is actually going to throw an error. And so, especially if you do this, if we do this, let's try and run this. Nope, it didn't like the bar in there. So and my person, so we'd have to do it like this. We'll say my person, dot age, I'm gonna put that in there, dot age equals 52. And we have to start with, in this case, we have to define, we can't just set myperson.age. We have to first say that my person is an object that can accept keys. So now we can do age 52. This is another thing that I've banged my head against many times, is just trying to set var myperson.age, and that doesn't work. It'll throw an error. So if we just try and run that, it'll say, hey, wait a minute, there's a syntax error here. Unexpected token dot. You can't set var myperson.age unless var myperson exists first. So now we can set myperson as an object, and then we can set myperson.age. And that'll work. And this just always outputs whatever the value is. So you notice myperson.age is set as 52, and it's going to output the value of the last statement. And so we can do that. So now we've set up myperson. The other thing we can do to shortcut this is actually do this and say var myperson equals an object, and that object has a key of age 52. So we can do that. And let's go ahead and refresh this. And I know I'm going through quick kind of some of these examples, but hopefully the different, there's kind of a, with programming and especially with JavaScript, there's 100 ways to skin a cat. And I'm just kind of running through some of these different ways to do things, because this is obviously very syntactically shorter to say var myperson equals an object with an age of 52 is shorter than saying var myperson and then myperson age equals 52. And so you can see now we've got 2 lines of code. Well, in reality, we can make that the exact same thing with just 1 line of code. And so a lot of times you'll want to do that. If you want to keep things short, sometimes it's harder to read when you do it this way because you're not quite sure what all is happening, especially if you've got a lot of things going on. But sometimes it's a benefit. You want to keep it short. You want to keep it terse. You don't want to have a lot of code. So you're going to do it in a shortcut way of doing the same thing. So both of those work. They do the exact same thing. And one doesn't necessarily process faster than the other. There might be a very, very, very slightly minimal impact. We're talking about in picoseconds, like super small fractions for the actual compiling of the code. If there's an extra 10 characters versus a shorter piece of code, but in reality they process exactly the same at the exact same speed. There's not one that's faster than the other, but this is a much shorter way to write it, and sometimes it makes more logical sense when somebody's reading it to do it in the shortcut way. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes the longer way of writing things makes more sense logically when you're looking at it, especially if it's a longer piece of code doing a lot more. You might actually want to write it out a little bit deeper so that you can read it later when you go back to it. But they do the exact same thing. So there's 100 ways to skin this cat. But if we go in now and say, run this code, and our logic here, you would think this says if myperson.age equals 45, then output this console log. So let's see if that's what happens. And if we go in here and we just refresh this and we run this, then we'll see it output, holy cow. But that's not right because I set myperson age to 52, but my logic here says myperson.age equals 45. If it equals 45, then output the statement. Well, if it's not 45, it shouldn't output that statement, but it did. The reason it did is because I didn't evaluate whether myperson.age is equal to 45. I set myperson.age equal to 45, and 45 is greater than 0, and so 45 always is true. Now if I do this, and run this one, let's refresh, just so we know we're fresh. We run this, notice now I got no console log. And this would be even more confusing if I actually set this to 0. Let's refresh this. Now let's paste that in. So we can see our code, myperson, age is 0. If myperson age equals 0, then output the statement. but I get no output, but I set my age to 0. Why is it not working? Well, it's not working because I set my person.age equal to 0. And because 0 is considered to be false, then this returns if false, then output this. Well, it's not false, so it's not outputting it. And so this is looking for a true statement. And so it's important to know that 0 equates to false when it comes to this. And 1 or greater equates to true. And so when we set it to 45, then it's always going to return true. So these are the little gotchas as you're writing code that it will look like things are working, or it will look like things are broken, when in reality, it was just a syntactical error. So now if I go in and I run this, now I've got my person age is set to 0. And if my person's age equals 0, is equal to 0, then output. And now I get my statement. Now it's syntactically correct. Now I get the proper evaluation. So those are, that's something that's very important to understand, the difference between an evaluation operator or an assignment operator versus a logical operator, like with the double equals or the not equals, the exclamation point, or the greater than or equal to, or the less than or equal to. So these are called logical operators, and that means the statement is going to be evaluated versus the assignment operator of equals means it's going to take the value of this and assign it to this variable. Does that all kind of make sense? I know that kind of that difference sometimes can be a little bit confusing, and honestly, it has caught the absolute best developers just slamming heads against walls, trying to figure out why things aren't working the way that they think they should because they've set the wrong type of operator. Awesome, very cool. Jamie says, or Jeremy says, yes, makes sense. So that's good. So hopefully you guys will never run into that, but just know that equals is equal and case sensitive. And Dan is asking that question. Yeah, equals is actually, it can be a little tough one to wrap heads around sometimes, but it's actually the completely equal. Are they the exact same thing? So with strings, then yes, and let's just run through and see if that's the case, because honestly, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head whether that's entirely true. So let's say, let's set my person, so we'll do var my person equals first Jamie. And then we'll do a couple of statements. So we'll my person dot first equals Jamie. And let's do, and actually, I don't even think you're gonna need to do, so this string and this string are not the same thing. And so, and if my person check two. And so let's just run this, and we shouldn't get any console logs at this point, because uppercase Jamie and lowercase Jamie are not the same, regardless of whether you're doing just an equality check or whether you're doing a complete equality check. Yeah, so we don't get anything there. And I'm trying to think of a better way to check this. So let's do a quick Google Def on this, because it has to do with more with variables and absolute checking JavaScript. So let's just pull this up here and take a look and see what we get. Okay. So JavaScript is very, very similar, very different. Here are the difference. Triple equals is strict equality. That means the type and the value have to be the same. So 5 and 5 is equal to true. Both strings, both equal, true and true, both booleans equal values. 77 and 77. So this is probably actually a better value, better check. So these are similar, but they're not the same type. So we get a false. And again, this would probably be the only time that you are actually checking this. Would be if you're using the triple equals. Would be if you're trying to check for a very specific value that may otherwise be interpreted differently. So, so that would be if age equals 0. So we do, so we'll do my person, and we'll do age 0. Okay, so this would evaluate to true in this case because this is 0. But false can also be considered. So this is 0 and false can oftentimes be interchanged because 0 is the same as false when it comes to truthiness. But in this case, when we set age to false, age triple equals 0 this is going to evaluate to false because 0 and false, even though they have the same value in equality statements or in logical statements, they aren't the same type. One's a Boolean and one is an integer. And so then it can be important when you might have something that can come across as either an integer or it can come across as true. And a better example would be true. Or age equals 1. Okay, so 1 is also, will evaluate to true. So that would evaluate to true. They can be interchanged that way. But when you do this equals, equal, then these are not the same type. One's a Boolean and one is an integer. So they aren't, even though they're logically equal to each other, they're not strictly equal to each other. So this is not something I use often. I mean, I can't think of the last time I used this triple equals, but it's really, this is when you're gonna get into it, when you're gonna want it, when you're trying to check to make sure that things are strictly equal. They're the same type. They're both Boolean and they're both true, or they're both integer and they're both 1 versus something that could be evaluated as either or, like an integer can be evaluated. You know, if we just put inside this if statement, if 1 is equal to true. Heck, 2 is equal to true. Anything other than 0 or anything greater than 0 is considered to be true, but they're not Booleans. This evaluation infers that there's a Boolean value here. So 1, it can be considered, it can be translated to be a Boolean, meaning it's a yes or a no, it's a true or a false, but it's not actually a Boolean. So that's where 1 equals true is not the same. So let's actually, let's see if we can run that, see if that actually, it might not work perfectly here. So we can say 1 equals true. That's a true statement. 1 equals true is false. 0 equals false is true. 0 equals false is false. So that's the big difference between those two, between an equals and a triple equals, is that strict type check versus value check. Does that make sense, Dan? Hopefully that's good. It's a rarely used thing, And they probably even talk about that in here. It's like, it is truly rarely used. But it does come in handy. So in this case too, like, and I didn't even actually realize this, but it does look like an example that they had in here is 77 equals 77 is true. So that's actually good. So you're comparing a string, the string version of the number and the number itself are both the same. So that they're doing a little translation for you there from string to number when you're doing that evaluation. But if you really need to know, is this actually a number, then, and it's the number 77 is the value. Well, I didn't even type that right, so that's not going to ever evaluate as true. But so that's another case where, you know, I'm checking, is this truly an integer and have a value of 77 versus is it just a string? It might be a string that has a value of 77. What console can be, yeah, totally. Dan says, yeah, one more example for what console can be used for. Yeah, if you ever have a question of whether something's going to work or not, and I do this all the time, I go to my pages, if I'm writing code and I want to check, okay, is this going to do what I think it's going to do? Just run it on a page. You can run it in an empty console if you just are checking JavaScript, but you can also go to, an actual ClickFunnels page because jQuery's already been included. So if we just go to cfprotools.com, this is running on ClickFunnels. So we can pull this up. I can go into my inspector and say, okay, I want to figure out, I want to find something on this page. I want to see if the code that I'm writing is going to work. So let's say, okay, I want to find my CFAR form. So if I'm going to write this chunk of code and I want to see, okay, is this going to actually do what I think it's going to do? It's going to return my CFAR form. I can run that and yep, it did what I wanted to do. Here's my CFAR form. So it takes me right to that spot. So yeah, you can do, run your code right here in the console and check it first, and then you can actually put it into your add-on and build it into your page. It's a great way to test your code before you actually put it into the page to make sure it's going to work. So you can do that locally without actually impacting the page for everybody else. And once you're pretty positive that it works the way you're going to want it to, then you actually embed it into the tracking codes. And then it'll appear and work for everyone. So yeah, so those are a lot of the foundations. So we kind of went through the different syntax. We did different notations, object versus array notations. We've gone through equality statements or evaluation statements, logical statements, logical operators versus assignment operators. We've gone through, properties and values and functions and setting those up and having anonymous functions versus named functions and when you would use each of those. So we've covered a lot, and we're a little over 3 hours in here. So I think we're probably at a good point we've laid a good foundation. I think we're at a good point to then call it good for today, and then we'll do another session, and we'll plan on doing that next Saturday, and we'll go through and actually get into the guts of ClickFunnels and how we write some of this custom code. Like, how do I go through and build out these actual custom add-ons so that if you want to do these same sorts of things on your own pages, but maybe take these and customize or build your own from scratch and customize those. We'll get more into that in the next session. Now that we all kind of have a good foundation for what it means. That way I don't just jump in and start writing code and you're like, well, wait a minute, I don't know what that means versus that, or why did you do square brackets instead of curly brackets, or why did you do double equals instead of single equals and all of that. Actually, this brings me up to a good example. Though, this is one that we should cover that we didn't cover before, is the OR operator and the AND operator. So let's jump in and let's do an example of that real quick before we close out. So let's do this, age equals 0. And we got a couple things we can do here. My person dot first equals Amy. Okay, so you'll notice in this one, this is inside. Again, these are logical operators. So this is a logical operator This is a logical operator. And then we have another one that's the OR. So this double ampersand, so all of your logical operators will have doubles. The triple equals is the one that is, and also you can do a not double equals, which is the same thing as the opposite of a triple equals. So that's an option too. So if you wanted to evaluate that something is not exactly the same, then you can do that. But logical operators have the doubles. Assignment is just a single equals. So in this case, we've got this ampersand, double ampersand, and we've got the double bars here. So the double ampersands means and, just like ampersand means and then the double bars means or. So in the way that these work is it evaluates. So basically this reads, if my person.age equals 0 and my person.first equals Jamie, then this is true and output this line. If we put this as or, then it would say my person.age equals 0 or my person.first equals Jamie, then this evaluates to true and output this line. And so in this case, the first one, when we have and, that doesn't work because age is equal to 1, not 0. So this one's going to evaluate to false. This one evaluates to true, but because it's an and, it says false and true is never true, so don't do anything. But if I put or here, then this one will evaluate to true because this one is false, but this one is true. So a false or true is true. And then it will output this line. So that's your and or operators. And those you will use those quite often because you might want to check a couple of different variables to see if this one is this or this one is this, then do this thing. Or you might want to say if this one is this and this other one is also this, then output do something or do some work. So those are important to understand and know. Another thing that's important to understand about the way these operators work is that they shortcut from left to right. So because in this case we've got an or operator here. So when we've got an or operator here, we can shortcut out of this and we can say, okay, so my person.age equals 0. Okay, well, this one is going to evaluate to false. So then it's going to say, oh, well, I've got an or here, so I better go check that one too. But if this one was set to 1, it would never check my person.first equal whether it's equal to Jamie or not. Because if this one equals true, and then this is an or, well, it says I don't even need to check if anything else is true because my first one was true. So this will never even get evaluated. So it's only going to evaluate this first chunk of this code. And it doesn't evaluate the second. So for things that might take some more time to evaluate, especially if you're going to call a function within here, because you can actually call a function here. And if we had a my function, that returns a value, and that's something we needed to cover as well, then, okay, so this one's going to return true, but maybe this does has to do a ton of work. And it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of resources, a lot of memory, and all that stuff. And we'd really rather not run that if we don't have to. So if we evaluate this statement first, hey, the first thing we need to check is this person 1 year old? If they are, then great, just do the thing. But if they're not 1 year old, then let's go ahead and calculate out some other reason why we might want to do this work. And that's just going to take some time. Then this is a good thing to note is this shortcut mechanism. So you want to put your most easily evaluated statements first, or your most highest priority statements first, because they can shortcut. If they return true, they will shortcut the rest of the function and it will never get called. And so, so let's do this. And let's do something like for I equals 0, I less than 100, I plus plus console.log I equals plus I. Okay, so now we have a my function here that's going to loop through and output I equals whatever the value is 100 times. And then it's going to return true. So return statements are something we didn't cover. And so let's go ahead and put that on our list here. Return statements are also something that's important for your functions. And so we'll put it right here. Return. So return, we can return anything we want to. In this case, we want to return true because that's what we're trying to evaluate here is true. We could return 1 here, which would also be true. We can return false if we wanted that to be false. We could do an evaluation within this function and determine whether we want to return a true or false here. So return is basically saying, hey, so we could start with variable, my return equals false. And then inside of here, we could do a bunch of work that sets my return equal true. And then we could return my return. And then that's going to return whatever the current value of this variable is, which in this case is going to be true. So even though we set it as false here to start with, we're going to change that value and then we'll return the current value of that variable. And so a return statement is, you don't always have to return from a function inside of JavaScript, but sometimes when you call this function and you, then that return is, instead of it just doing work, this function now is no longer just going to do the work. We actually need some sort of a return so we know what to, whether we want to do this thing or not. So if we're using this function inside of an if statement, we need to return something. We need to return a true or a false. And so that's important. Also, if we wanted to say, we could also say I. So we could do, set var I equals 0 here. And this is where we could do a while I less than 100. I plus plus. And we could return I. So now we've got a function that starts out at, I starts out at 0, and while it's less than 100, we loop through and reset it. So the last value of I is going to be actually 99. Then we return the value of I. So, but that return doesn't do anything in and of itself, but now we can say var my I val equals my function. And now what happens is once we call this, then, and if we were to output console log my I val, and let's see if I wrote this code right. Sometimes when I do things in a hurry, they're not always 100% correct. So let's go ahead and refresh this. So now we'll spit that in, and now it loops through and it's set 100 and output, is that right? Yeah. So we've got all my outputs. Okay, so the first one is set to, it's set to 1 because I incremented before I actually output. So I've got my I value and it's set to 100, and that's my console log right here, right, of my I val. So let's add to that so we know that's where that's coming from. My I val plus my I val. So let's copy that, and then let's paste that in. And now it tells me my I val, the value is equal to 100. Okay, so that's the value of doing a return. So if you're going to do some work on something and you want to set a variable based on the result of all that work, you want to calculate out, is this thing true or not? Or you want to calculate out what's my actual value. You want to do some math on something and you just want to set a variable equal to the result of that, then you'll use this return statement. So you're going to do a bunch of work, and you're going to set a variable and you're going to return that value at the end. So that function doesn't have to in JavaScript return anything. It might just do work. And that's good enough. That's called a procedural function. It just kind of does the work, but it doesn't return anything in response. Otherwise, you can return, and then you can set a variable equal to the result of that function. So this isn't setting this variable equal to the actual function call. It's setting it equal to the return of that function. So that's an important concept to have as well. And then, but if we go through and we check this like we were looking for here, we can set my function and say we return false here. We can do that. And so now we've got this my function. It's going to loop through 100 times. We saw that happen already. We saw the output of that all this time. And now if we go in and we call this, and let's refresh this. So basically what we're doing is saying, hey, if my person.age equals 1, or my function, which is going to call my function and expect some sort of return of true or false. And then if it's that, then output that. And actually let's return, so let's actually return false there. So now let's go through and run this code and see what happens. So we're gonna load that in, and you'll notice that we didn't run my function at all. It didn't output anything from this my function because it shortcutted, because the first thing that happened is it evaluated this statement to true, so it didn't need to evaluate this at all. So we just bypassed a bunch of work and a bunch of time by setting this statement first, and then it shortcutted this all the way across. The opposite is true if we were doing an and this first statement evaluates to false. So now if we were to flip that, now we have an and, but this first statement is false. So if this one is false, then it doesn't matter whether we evaluate this or not, because it will never be true. Because a false and a true is still false. A false and a false is still false. The only way to ever get a true here and to output, to hit this line, is to have all true across the board. But because we hit false the very first time, it shortcuts this call. And so now the same thing, if we run this, then it's never going to hit, it never outputs our check2, and it never runs our my function, because the very first thing we evaluated was, is my person.age equal to 0? And if it's not, then don't do anything else. We don't need to do anything else. But now if I change that to 1, if my person.age equals 1 and my function, let's run that and see what we get. If we run that and we paste that in, now we'll see we go through and we did call my function, but we also noticed that my function returned false. So we didn't actually output the console log of check2, because this still returned false. So this one was true, but this one was false. And so because true and false can't be true, then it didn't run this. So, but now if we return true here and run this, now we'll see we run our function and we get a true result, so we call our check2 console log. So that's how these and or operators work, and the shortcut concept of these things. And so it's important to know we wouldn't want to call my function first, or we might want to. Maybe we do always want to call my function. Maybe we want that work to always happen, but if it happens, and we also want to check one more thing. So we want to call this one first if we always want this to call. That way it always gets evaluated. So if all we did, so we saw the first time through that this didn't get run, right? So, and we return, and we'll leave this one as return true. So when we run this one, then we see that our function never gets called. It never runs. But if we go back and we swap the order of these things, and now we call the function first, it's the exact same code, we just swap the order a little bit. But if we call that now we get it evaluated. We still don't get our check2 output because my person.age is still equal to 0. It's not equal to 1, so therefore we don't output this. And so but we still get our console log. So we still called our function. So maybe we always want to have this function run, and because this function might do a bunch of work to set a bunch of variables, and we need that to happen. But once that happens, we also want to check to see, is this person equal to 0? And if they're not, then we don't want to do the additional work in here. So it's important to understand the order of operations within these statements and the return statements. And then the other thing that we can do is, say we have something like this. And you just saw how easy it is to forget that you have to use the double equals, and that assignment operator of just a single equals would have totally screwed things up. So now we have this, and so now we've got 3 things. So you might be thinking, okay, so we've got an and, but then we've got an or. Well, how do we evaluate this? Just like math, and just like algebra, these things are ordered, are evaluated from left to right. So it's first going to evaluate my function. Does this my function return true or false? And if it returns my function and my person age equals 0, then this gets evaluated first. And if this is so say this returns true and this returns false, it's going to stop. It's not going to evaluate the rest of this. And so this is never going to happen. But if this is true and this is true, then this or comes next. And honestly, I don't even know what that would do if this came back as false. But what you want to do, what most often when you have this combination of ands and ors, you'll want to actually wrap these things. So ands and ors aren't going to mix very well together. So you're usually going to wrap them in another set of parentheses. And so this one is going to say, so if this is true and the combination of these things returns true, then my statement is true, and then run this. So that's where grouping comes in as important, is using additional parentheses so that you can have groups. Otherwise, if you wanted to say, hey, I've got 3 different things that need to be true before I do this, then if you do an and another ampersand here, then it's going to be, is this true and this true and this true? If that's the case, then run my statement. The alternative is ors. So if you want to say, hey, if any one of these things is true, so if my function is true, or the age is equal to 0, or my first name is equal to Jamie, then that's going to return a true and run my statement. Otherwise, if they all return false, then it's not going to run anything. So yeah, so you can kind of group these things together. And so you can run multiples. You can have multiple ands, as many as you want to. Ands, ors. Just remember that if you use a mix of ands and ors, you're probably going to need to group them like so. And same here. So you could say, if this is true, or the combination of myperson.age is true and myperson.first is equals Jamie is true, then return this. So the extra set of parentheses, you wrap them in parentheses so that you group those statements together and they get evaluated as a group and return a single truth or false to this statement here. So that's ands and ors and grouping and return statements inside of your functions and kind of what you would use them for and how important they can be. But just know that you don't have to return from a function, but you can. So this one returns a value of true, but it doesn't really matter that it returns that. I don't necessarily have to use that return value. So I can still just call my function and it will run the code. It'll return true, but it doesn't go anywhere because I'm not done a variable assignment here. But I can also set my return equals my function. And now the return result of this will get stored in this value. And that can be important because you might want to know later at a different scope, what was the actual return? I don't need to know everything else that happened inside. I just need to know what value is actually returned. So you might want to restore that return value there to reference it later at a higher scope. So that, I think, covers, so we did returns, functions, methods, and then we talked about operators. We'll just call it operators. So we've got our ands and our ors and our logical operators and our assignment operators, and we've got our return values. So I think that's a really, really, really strong foundation. And hopefully you guys, hopefully this is valuable and you kind of can see a few things already, examples and at least understanding from even if you were to walk out right now and be able to go and write a piece of pseudocode with loops and fors and functions and all that you could hand off to somebody else to actually make you a functional application. I think that's a pretty valuable expertise to have, at least to understand from a conceptual level how code works and the different constructs that are available to you, so that even if it makes it easier to communicate and work with another developer, then that's a skill that's worth having. Of course, the cheat sheet of things that I do on a regular basis, how to find certain elements. ClickFunnels has some specific ways of tagging things inside of your pages that you'll often want to find, like your product selector, how to find that, find the products within your product selector, how to find which products were selected on an order, how to modify that, and overall how ClickFunnels works on your order pages, your OTO pages and all that. We'll kind of walk through those things as well, but if we've got some good examples, we'll probably start with those as just the foundational of, okay, here's how we would craft a custom add-on. So that being said, I think we'll wrap it up for today. I think we're at what, 3.5 hours. So I think I'll let you all enjoy the rest of your Saturday. And we've got some beautiful weather here in Eagle, Idaho. So I hope you have some beautiful weather where you're at, can enjoy some weekend. And we will catch up and talk again next Saturday. So